Mary, my dear, please, put the knife down. I slowly back away. Mary, do you hear me? I'm your husband, remember, I love you, Mary. I try to calm my wife. She lowers her head wearing a nightgown, clutching a large kitchen knife, trembling and shuffling her feet heavily. Mary, are you still with me? I know you can hear me. Mary, no, please, stop, Mary, I scream. But it's useless. She's gone, left me forever. My wife is no more. In her place is an empty shell, a body without a soul. I hear a repulsive sound, the crunch of bones, and watch as her limbs lengthen, bending into grotesque and unnatural shapes. Thick, dark red blood starts to flow from her body, and her face is covered with white-pink blisters. Her beautiful chestnut hair falls onto the wooden floor, leaving her bald before my eyes. Mary wheezes heavily, then begins to moo like an animal. She's no longer human. Before me stands a mutant, a half-dog, half-human creature. And this creature is ravenous. It lifts its lifeless, glassy eyes to me and starts sniffing. The monster senses my scent. It's ready to tear me apart at any moment, to devour me. But I can't move. I'm in shock. I want to scream, to cry. I'm furious and disoriented. I don't understand how this could have happened. I've lost her, the only person I loved with all my heart. I was warned. I knew this could happen. But why didn't I save her? Make a plan. Think about Mary. I see the creature wheezing, slowly approaching me. I snap back to reality and begin to retreat. The mutant senses it. It knows I'm trying to escape. The mutant starts making sounds, trying to speak, and I hear Mary's voice. Save me. Wheezing, mooing, and again. Save me. Wheezing, it growls like an animal. And again my wife's voice. She begs me and screams, Save, save, save. I cover my ears, and at that moment, the mutant grabs my leg. I fall and remember how it all began. It was raining that day. Mary had gone to the hospital for a night shift. She was a doctor, and I was home alone. It was already late at night, and I was getting ready to go to bed when there was a knock at the door. As usual, I checked the surveillance camera I had installed outside and saw a strange man on the porch. He looked very disheveled, like a homeless person, wearing an old, crumpled coat and boots. His eyes made me very uneasy. They seemed insane. He was muttering something and looked extremely nervous. I approached the door and started speaking loudly, telling him to leave or I would call the police. However, the night visitor continued to mutter and knock on the door. I repeated my threats. Then he took a smartphone out of his pocket and started showing it to the camera. I heard his voice. Harry, take it. It's dangerous, but you'll understand. Save yourself. Us. Harry. I don't have much time left. I was surprised and agitated. He knew my name. But who was this man? Why did he want me to take the smartphone? I looked through the surveillance camera again and saw him staring intently into it. His facial features seemed familiar to me. Very thin, with stubble, but he vaguely reminded me of my late father. At some point, the night visitor began to smile and started speaking loudly. Smells like something's burning. Smells like something's burning. Smells like burning. Then he suddenly started laughing loudly like a madman. It didn't last long, just a few minutes, and then he stopped laughing and lowered his head. I was about to call the police when I heard his voice again. "Forgive me for everything, Harry," the night visitor said, looking intently at the camera once more. I saw him pull out a gun, press it to his temple, and bam! I was terrified, fell to my knees, and closed my eyes. But when I looked at the camera again, he was gone. Then I gathered my courage and opened the door. As expected, there was no corpse on the floor. The night visitor had vanished, leaving only the smartphone as proof that it hadn't all been a hallucination. That night, I couldn't sleep. I thought long and hard about whether I should call the police. Perhaps there was a dangerous madman with a firearm wandering around the neighborhood. But I felt that it wasn't so simple, and what I had seen and heard that night was the beginning of something horrifying. Something was coming, and my anxiety only grew. I kept asking myself questions. Why did this man look so much like my father? Why was he acting so strangely? And what about the smartphone? I had never seen such a model before. Morning came without me noticing. I decided not to go to work this time. It was irresponsible of me, but I hadn't slept all night, and to be honest, I wouldn't be of much use. So I called my boss and took the day off. I wanted to wait for Mary and tell her what had happened last night. Mary came back early. She was very tired, upset, and went straight to take a shower. I figured she was upset because of work. Something unpleasant must have happened. I started making breakfast and, while waiting for my wife, turned on the TV out of habit. The news was on. A clean-shaven anchor in an expensive suit with a serious face was reporting on another fire, floods, attacks, criminals, and the police. Economic growth had slowed, major company stocks had crashed, and a new disease had been identified in a country with a complicated name. One news story followed another as I watched with a sleepy gaze, chewing on a burnt toast. At some point, an advertisement for a new smartphone caught my attention. The model of the future, multifunctional and ultra-thin, with 2 frameless screens coming soon. I heard from the TV, but I couldn't believe it. This smartphone, this model, I had already seen it. Something similar was lying in my nightstand drawer. I hurried to the bedroom to make sure it was indeed the same smartphone the night visitor had brought yesterday. Mary had already gotten out of the shower and was drying her hair. She was slightly surprised by my behavior when I burst into the bedroom like a madman and started rummaging through the nightstand. "What's wrong, dear?" Mary asked me. I pulled out the smartphone and started waving it in front of her, telling her what had happened last night. Mary was a little scared and agitated. She began asking me what was on the smartphone. Of course, I hadn't turned it on and didn't know, but I was intensely curious. So I sat on the bed and turned on the smartphone. At first glance, it was an ordinary smartphone with a slightly worn screen, dusty and smudged with dirt in places. But what I found in the media section alarmed me greatly. There were many videos and photos of humanoid creatures, the kind you see in sci-fi movies. Mary felt uncomfortable looking at them, so I decided to postpone viewing the photos and read the messages instead. The first one was dated March 12th, 2026. In it, someone named Albert wrote to the phone's owner that he found the mutations beautiful, and his research proved that they had finally made a breakthrough. The second message came from someone named Jiro on March 26th, 2026, and he wrote, "There are few of us left. Every day someone disappears or just leaves. I'm losing friends, valuable doctors and scientists. Last week, our dear Ayame got infected. She's in quarantine now, and she knows it's the end. The soldiers are very scared. They're nervous. And if it weren't for the captain and the government's orders, I think we would have been shot." The next message from Jiro came in March. "I've sent you the data. It's all we managed to do. Ayame is dead. The captain killed himself in the bathroom. There's no news from the government. They're keeping us in the lab. I don't know what's happening outside. The soldiers aren't saying anything. They're going crazy. I feel like I'll have to leave soon too. Forgive me, we ran out of time." There were no more messages from Jiro. After finishing reading, I set the smartphone aside and looked at Mary. She was also confused, but it was hard for us to believe that both the phone and all the messages on it were from the future. It all seemed like science fiction or a prank. So we decided it was best to go to the police and hand over the smartphone. However, before calling the police, I decided to dig a little more into the phone. Mary said she was very tired and went to bed. I didn't want to disturb her further, so I took the phone and went down to the living room to watch the videos and photos alone. The first video that caught my attention was about animals. It was footage from surveillance cameras dated December 17, 2025. The recording was taken in a long, bright room, lined with cages along the walls, housing monkeys, dogs, cats, and rats, with a large iron table in the center. There were 2 people in the room, their faces covered by masks, and they were dressed head to toe in protective suits of a white-yellowish color. One of the scientists seemed to be a fan of classical music, as Beethoven's Ninth Symphony played in the laboratory. They moved from cage to cage, sprinkling and injecting something into the animals. The strangest thing I noticed was that the animals were silent. No sounds of barking, growling, or monkey chatter. Absolute silence. Yet, the video showed that all the animals were alive and occasionally moving in their cages. The next video was dated January 3, 2026. The same laboratory, but now there were more scientists. In masks and protective suits, they gathered around the table on which lay the corpse of a monkey, its arms and legs spread out, and its entire abdomen from neck to thigh was split open. The scientists were talking amongst themselves. One of them was loudly cursing. "You amateurs! How much longer do we have to wait? I'm losing not only time and money but also my reputation," he yelled. "If you can't handle it, Eagleman, just leave." "I'm tired of covering your ass," said one of the scientists, turning and storming out of the lab, slamming the door behind him. Several others in protective suits followed him out. Only one scientist remained, who I understood was Eagleman. He lowered his head and stared at the floor, visibly upset. He muttered something under his breath, and listening closely I heard, "Who's covering for whom? Damn bastard. Losing money? Cut the budget and demand the impossible, screw you." Then, in a fit of rage, he grabbed a tray of some liquids and forcefully threw it onto the iron table where the monkey's corpse lay. Shouting something loudly again, the scientist left the lab. The video continued for several seconds with nothing happening. I was about to switch to another video when I noticed something move on the iron table where the monkey lay. It slid off and fell to the floor. It's hard to explain what it looked like. Pink and slimy, without skin, something like a brain. I don't know how, but this pink monstrosity moved slowly toward one of the cages where a dog was sitting. The video ended there. In a hurry, I played the third video, also dated January 3, 2026. The video showed the same lab, but it was filmed from a different camera. I gathered that several hours had passed since the scientists' conflict, and the room was empty. However, the camera captured something horrifying. The video clearly showed a dog eating something slimy. I realized it was the same cage where the pink slime had crawled. This abomination made unpleasant sounds. Each time the dog bit or chewed it, the pink slime screamed like a monkey. After a while, the dog started whining and then frantically gnawing at the cage. The recording ended there. Chills ran down my spine. Honestly, none of this seemed like a joke. The camera footage looked realistic. If all this was true, what awaited us in the future? I decided I needed to fully investigate this smartphone, watch all the videos, read all the messages, look at all the photos, check the phone numbers. And just as I was about to watch the fourth video, there was a knock on the door. I looked at the surveillance camera and saw my brother Patrick on the porch. "What's up?" I said, opening the door for my brother. "Harry, I've lost all my money," Patrick complained, walking into the house. "Why aren't you at work? Decided to follow in your older brother's footsteps and become unemployed?" He started joking. "I'm not feeling well," I lied. Patrick looked at me with feigned suspicion, then suddenly started yelling loudly, Mary? How could you let Patrick slack off work? Mary, where are you? Once again, my brother was being a fool. I had to ask him to be quieter, explaining that my wife had been on duty all night and was now resting. Patrick listened to me, which was rare, and we spent the rest of the time chatting about various nonsense. I didn't want to tell my brother about what had happened to me last night or show him the smartphone. He would blow this situation out of proportion, turn it into a tragedy, a comedy, or worse, genuinely worry about me. In reality, Patrick is very smart. He works for the government. Unfortunately, I don't know what he does there, as he rarely talks about his job, and I don't ask. But I sometimes imagine he has a very important mission. Patrick left in the evening. After seeing him off, I decided to return to studying the smartphone, but I was distracted by Mary. She was in a bad mood because she had lost a patient the day before. After surgery and prolonged therapy, the patient was on the mend, but due to a sudden infection, they quickly passed away. Mary wanted to relax and take a walk, and I couldn't refuse my beloved wife. We went to the nearest pub, had a few drinks, and decided to stroll along the waterfront. It was a bit chilly outside. The spring breeze brushed against my face as I walked, thinking about what I had seen on the smartphone. I told Mary everything and warned her that I wasn't planning to call the police yet. I was too curious to find out what else the phone held. My wife didn't argue with me, only asked me to be more rational and not to take what I saw too much to heart. Returning home, I sat down again to study the smartphone and played the fourth video. I was deeply shocked by what I saw. It started as usual. Scientists in masks and protective suits were conducting experiments on animals. Then one of the scientists noticed that one of the cages with a dog had been gnawed from the inside, and the animal lay motionless. He called his colleague, and they discussed something for a few minutes. Then they opened the cage, took out the dog, and placed it on the same iron table. When one of the scientists attempted to perform an autopsy, the dog's head suddenly fell to the floor. The scientist stepped back as the head started spinning in place. Then, with a horrifying crack, bones began to sprout from the head like tentacles. In an instant, the dog's head turned into a terrifying creature resembling a spider. It began to whine and bark. The scientists clearly hadn't expected this, and for the first few seconds they watched in horror as the animal transformed. Then one of them began to back away toward the door. The spider-like mutant seemed to notice this and lunged at him, barking. It started tearing and gnawing at the scientist's suit. I heard terrible screams. The second scientist grabbed a chair and tried to help his colleague, managing to hit the mutant and throw it against the wall. However, the creature immediately got up and ran out the door. Meanwhile, the injured scientist continued to scream in pain while his colleague called for help. But that was just the beginning. Within a couple of minutes, several more people arrived in the lab. They began to examine the injured scientist, who had already lost consciousness by then. They didn't notice the impending danger. The dog's torso was still on the iron table, and it suddenly began to twitch uncontrollably. Then bones started growing from the torso too. The scientist who had witnessed this scene a few minutes earlier screamed and ran out of the lab. The others watched in amazement as another mutant transformed. At that moment, the injured scientist, who had been lying on the floor a moment ago, jumped up like an animal and sank his teeth into one of the people. The second person, in shock, backed away, not noticing the mutant creeping up behind him. The camera recording ended there. I turned off the smartphone and couldn't collect myself for some time. It was terrifying and very unpleasant. I started to wonder, could all this be true? It all looked like scenes from horror movies. But what if it does happen? Should I take some measures then? But what should I do? Call the police? Will they believe me? Or should I keep the smartphone, find this laboratory, Wait, what am I thinking? Do I look like a superhero? Can I handle such a task? First, I need to thoroughly examine all the videos on this phone and then take some action. I decided to rest, sleep, and resume watching the videos and photos in the morning. That night, I had heavy dreams. Spider-like mutants, people in protective suits and masks resembling dogs and rats chasing me, a mysterious night guest committing suicide, all of it merged into one continuous nightmare. The next day, I was home alone again. Mary had gone to work and I decided to take another day off. I had an important reason, but I told my boss I still wasn't feeling well. I grabbed my smartphone and... The fifth video was also a camera recording, but this time I realized it was from a portable body camera worn by a lab security guard. He was walking down a dark corridor where a red light flickered intermittently, and the sound of an alarm could be heard, suggesting an emergency had been declared in the building. Over the radio, there were noises, screams, gunshots, and pleas for help. On the walls, I noticed the inscription, "The future is in genetics." The entire corridor was splattered with blood and gore, with bodies scattered here and there. The guard moved slowly, checking for any signs of life among the corpses, his heavy breathing betraying his fear. Suddenly, he heard a loud growl behind him. The guard spun around to see a massive, horrifying creature with giant teeth and claws, resembling an oversized dog. Blood dripped from its fur, and pieces of a protective suit dangled from it. Oh God, this creature had once been a scientist. The guard was stunned and terrified by the monster. He drew his weapon and began firing. The monster dodged the bullets and fled. The guard, wasting no time, ran in the opposite direction. Along the way, he encountered convulsing corpses, wounded people begging for rescue, small, pink, slimy abominations leaping from wall to wall, and spider-like mutants of various sizes. But the guard, frightened by the scene, kept running without stopping. After a while, he reached a large, well-lit room where several other people were barricading the doors. A scientist with a badge that read Eckelman was giving orders. The guard approached him and reported what he had seen. Eckelman asked about the doors leading outside. The guard replied that they were blocked, and the control panel was on fire. Eckelman started cursing loudly, convinced that someone had done this deliberately, trapped them with these monsters. They were in a trap and had no idea how to get out. Time passed, and outside the door, screams, sobs, growls, and other vile sounds could be heard. People began to panic, realizing they were left alone with the monsters. Some scientists started proposing ways to escape: ventilation shafts, breaking through the ceiling, or descending into the basement. All these suggestions seemed absurd, but it was clear that people were desperate. Suddenly, one of the walls collapsed, filling the room with dust and debris, and through the enormous hole in the wall, monsters poured in. The recording ended there. I took a sip of coffee and began looking at the photographs. They were truly horrifying. In one of the photographs, I saw a half-human, half-rat creature, its body decomposing. In another, two people fused together at the bones like Siamese twins. One had no head, replaced by something resembling an enormous brain covered in an inexplicable rash and slime. The other was missing a lower jaw and eyes. It looked grotesque. The third photograph showed the same creature with giant teeth and claws resembling a dog. The picture was labeled Patient Zero. The fourth was the most horrifying. It depicted a large room with a massive slime in the center, more precisely, a mash of various human bodies fused together into a single terrifying organism. Some bodies had no skin, exposing a mesh of muscles and bones. Others had their internal organs spilling out. At the very top of this ghastly heap of bodies was a giant eye. I realized it was the same room where the remaining scientists and the guard had taken refuge. They hadn't managed to escape, unlike the monsters. The final photograph showed a massive hole in the building, which I understood to be the laboratory. All these mutants, slimes, werewolves, and other inexplicable creatures had broken free. This world was doomed. I put the phone down and began to ponder life. Had humanity made a fatal mistake? Had we sinned? And now is God punishing us? I wasn't a believer. I didn't go to church. But at that moment I began to pray. I realized humanity had opened the gates of hell with its experiments, allowing demons to enter our world. And now every person, regardless of their actions or whether they were truly a sinner, faced inevitable punishment. Could this be called divine retribution? Or perhaps God was trying to warn us. Is that why this smartphone ended up in my hands? But why me? No, that's a foolish question. I needed to act, to save Mary, Patrick, everyone. I had to warn them about what awaited us in 2026. But what to do? The first thought that came to mind was to contact my brother. I took my phone and started searching for Patrick's contact. Just then, the door opened and Mary walked in. She looked at me strangely. I hadn't expected her home so early, so I was slightly surprised. I asked her what was wrong. Mary said she came to talk to me. We settled in the living room. My wife was silent, and I was impatient because no matter how absurd it sounded, I needed to save the world. So I urged her to speak. She took a deep breath and began. "Harry, I was on a date," Mary said. "What? What date?" I didn't understand. "It's Patrick, your brother. I wasn't on a night shift, I was with him," Mary said. Her sudden revelation caught me off guard. I didn't know what to say in response. Mary continued, "This isn't the first time, Harry. I've been with him before, you see. We've been seeing each other for about 6 months. I know I've behaved terribly, but recently I realized I couldn't keep it a secret any longer. And it's all been a huge mistake, you understand? That's why I left that day. Believe me, it was our last meeting with Patrick," Mary finished. I thought back to yesterday when my brother came by. He wanted to talk to her and didn't expect to see me. I didn't know how to describe my feelings at that moment. I was devastated. My brother and my wife. Why did they do this? Didn't they have enough of my love? My chest hurt. I felt nauseous, and I was deeply hurt. I just stood up and walked out of the room. I didn't want to see Mary cry. I didn't want to see anyone. At that moment, I only thought my world had collapsed and now I was alone. I walked down the street not knowing what to do next. I wanted to drink and forget everything. So I went into the nearest pub, the very one where Mary and I had hung out last night. I asked the bartender for a strong drink and sat at a free table. For a while, I just stared into space, replaying Mary's words over and over in my mind. It was hard to believe, but why? Why did they do it? I wanted to cry, but held back with all my strength. At some point, I noticed a man. A tall, slightly overweight, middle-aged man was sitting at the neighboring table, loudly talking on the phone. He was certainly noisy, but the topic of his conversation caught my attention. He was loudly complaining and saying, "Yes, I understand, but that damn Eckelman is at it again. I told him to think about the shareholders, but he doesn't want to listen. You need to talk to him yourself." "Yes, I understand." "Okay, I'll keep going." The man noisily placed the phone on the table, then drank his beer and left the pub. I hurried after him. His gait, his behavior. I wasn't sure, but he resembled one of the scientists. Could it be the very beast, Patient Zero? He walked to a bus stop and got on a bus. I followed him. We rode a few blocks. He got off in the business district and headed to one of the high-rise buildings. I followed him, but in the lobby, security stopped me. Entry was by pass or invitation only. I had to leave and wait outside. I stood there for nearly 3 hours when I noticed him near the parking lot. He wasn't alone. He was with a man in a business suit. However, I couldn't see him clearly from behind the column, so I had to get closer. And when I saw the scientist's companion, I couldn't believe my eyes. Standing next to him was my brother Patrick. He was serious and arguing rather harshly with the scientist. What could this mean? Was everything I saw on the smartphone just a joke by my brother? No, wait, what is this? My brother suddenly grabbed the scientist and slammed him against the wall. He started shouting his threats, and I listened closely. This isn't a game of espionage. What you guys are up to is illegal, Patrick said. I'm not going to wait for a court ruling or anything else. You can just be eliminated. You need to understand that. Enough wasting time. Finishing his tirade, Patrick abruptly released the scientist, turned and walked away. The man stood there, muttering something under his breath before pulling out a cigarette and lighting it. It dawned on me. All of this was true. It wasn't a joke. The scientists, the videos, the photos, the monsters, the mutants, the blood and death, everything I had seen was real. My head spun from the realization that the smartphone truly held horrific events that could happen in the near future. Of course I had understood this, but deep down, I still had hope. Somewhere in the depths of my soul I hoped, believed, that everything would turn out fine. However, reality was cruel. My wife had cheated on me. In the near future, monsters and mutants would escape from an unknown laboratory, and my brother was somehow involved in all of it. Patrick, tell me, why do I deserve all this? I asked myself mentally. While I was thinking about my fate, the scientist made a phone call and then headed to the bus stop again. This time, I didn't follow him. I decided to go home. Too many events had happened in the last day, and I needed to think it all over and talk to Mary to put an end to the situation. I stood on the porch for a long time, hesitating to go inside. I thought, this is my home. Behind this door is the living room where Mary and I often sat together, the dining room where we shared meals, the bedroom where we had so much love. I was happy, but now, could I open the door and pretend I could forget all of this? To forgive would be to betray all those memories, the love we had shared. Could I forgive her? Without coming to a concrete conclusion, I finally decided to go inside. I opened the door, walked through the rooms, but found no one. Mary had left and left a note. The letter contained many words, but in short, she was asking for forgiveness and professing her love. While I was thinking she would stay with her mother. Cowardly traitor. She decided to shift the burden of solving this problem onto me. Why didn't she stay home? Why didn't she beg me to forgive her? Why didn't she fight for our love? Why did she run away? I couldn't bear it any longer. I started to cry. Never in my life had I felt so hurt and pained. I don't remember at what point, but I fell asleep. In the morning, a knock on the door woke me up. I struggled to get up. My head ached terribly because I had drunk heavily the night before. Moving with difficulty, I opened the door, and of course it was Patrick. Apparently, he thought I was at work and came to talk to Mary. But here I was opening the door again. My brother stood on the porch, smiling at me. Damn fool. At that moment, I wanted to punch him in the face, but I restrained myself. It was difficult, but I decided to talk to my brother first and then get into a fight. Patrick walked into the living room, suspecting nothing, apparently unaware that Mary hadn't told him. but my brother immediately noticed my bad mood. "Did you get into an accident? What's with the look, Harry?" Patrick started. "Did something happen? You can tell me," he continued. I looked at him with undisguised hatred and sadness. Patrick noticed my gaze. He had always been good at reading people and understanding what they were thinking. He probably suspected that I knew something about him and Mary. But first, I decided to find out his involvement with the secret laboratory. "It's a long story, easier to show," I began. "Listen, Patrick, I'm going to show you a smartphone. Take it seriously, this isn't a joke. I think you'll understand what it's about." With these words, I took out the smartphone and handed it to my brother. "Oh, this is a new model. Did you decide to give me a gift, Harry?" Patrick started joking, but I interrupted him. "Patrick, this isn't a joke. Watch the videos, look at the photos and messages. Take your time, you've got all the time you need." I decided to make myself something to eat while my brother went through the contents of the smartphone. A couple of hours later, Patrick walked into the dining room. He sat down across from me and placed the smartphone between us. My brother was grim, stunned, silent, and looked at me questioningly. "Can I know where you got this smartphone?" Patrick asked me. "Of course, I'll answer all your questions, but first I'd like to ask you something," I replied. My brother nodded silently. "I want to know if you have any connection to this laboratory," I asked. "Why do you think that?" Patrick answered with a question. "I saw you with one of the lab workers," I said shortly. "Well then, so you know a lot? Didn't expect that from you, Harry." All right, I owe you an explanation," Patrick continued. "First of all, you need to understand, I work for the government. I can't say which department, but to put it briefly, my area of responsibility is the activities of large corporate companies. This laboratory was under investigation, and I was tasked with finding out certain details." Patrick didn't seem like himself as he told me all this. For the first time in my life, I saw this side of my brother. Had I been so blind all these years, or had Patrick been hiding his true self skillfully? "You see, Harry, large companies always cooperate with the government, but they have their own secrets. We need to know how harmful these secrets are and whether they can be beneficial. Honestly, Harry, you could say you helped me by giving me this smartphone. That idiot from the lab was trying to play cat and mouse with us, posing as a double agent, a spy, but he was useless. However, now there's a lot I don't understand, and I'd like some answers too." Patrick finished his monologue. I had imagined many things, but I never expected my brother to be some kind of secret agent or government spy. And worst of all, I had lived in complete ignorance all these years, not understanding what was happening around me. I had been truly blind, and importantly, I hadn't paid attention to my loved ones. Perhaps seeing my detachment and coldness, Mary decided to cheat on me. I looked at Patrick again. Here he was, my brother. We grew up together, played together, sometimes argued. But he was always there, sharing toys, helping with schoolwork. He was strong, did well in school, won in sports, and was loved by girls. I was proud of him. I loved him. And now, in my dining room, sat a stranger. I wouldn't have recognized this Patrick. He was a stranger. All this time, he silently waited for me to answer his question. Patrick wasn't rushing me. I gathered my thoughts and told him, "A homeless man brought me this smartphone at night when I was home alone." And I told Patrick what had happened to me, what I had seen, and what I thought about it. It was clear that my brother didn't expect such an answer. Perhaps he still didn't understand the situation we were in. But I kept talking, trying to convince him to take action. He worked for the government, and if they stopped the research, nothing would happen, and the world would be saved. I told him we couldn't delay. However, Patrick was skeptical of my words. "I want to believe you, Harry, but all this sounds fantastical. Do you understand? I did see all those photos and videos. They're very creepy. But it could be photomontage or CGI," Patrick said. "You need to check the laboratory, Patrick. Stop them," I interrupted my brother. "It's not as simple as you think, Harry. My powers are limited. You can't just barge into a private lab. You have to understand that," my brother tried to convince me. "No, you don't understand, Patrick. This will happen if we don't stop them. Everything you saw on the smartphone will happen. Believe me, Patrick. I feel it. If you don't want to do it, just tell me where the laboratory is," I continued to insist. "Harry, first of all, I can't let you break the law. Second, I'll be honest, we don't know where this damned lab is. They've carefully hidden this information. Third, I promised to look into it. I'll definitely find this lab, and believe me, you don't need to worry about everything you saw," my brother tried to reassure me. However, his words only made me angrier. He thinks I'm some kind of paranoid fool, making a mockery of me. I was consumed with rage and I couldn't hold back. I started yelling at him. "Believe you, Patrick? Believe the man who's sleeping with my wife? A traitor who spat on his own brother's feelings? Did you have fun, Patrick? Did you tell jokes to my wife? Did you lie in bed and laugh at me? How can I trust someone like you? Answer me, brother. Do you even understand what you've done? You destroyed my marriage," I said, letting out everything I thought about him. I saw that Patrick wasn't surprised or shocked by my words. He looked at me with pain in his eyes. Tears ran down his cheek, but I didn't care. I was furious. I wanted to tear him apart, smash his face in. However, I restrained myself once again. To be honest, these emotional swings had exhausted me. I was very tired and didn't want to prove anything to anyone, so I just got up and opened the front door. Patrick understood everything. He took the mysterious smartphone and silently left the house. I locked the door behind him and went to take a shower. 3 days later, Mary called me. She wanted to meet. I invited her home. She came in the afternoon and we talked late into the night. The next morning, Mary packed her things and left. I couldn't forgive her. Just like my brother, we no longer talked or met. A month or two later, I received the divorce papers. Now I was single. It was very hard, and I decided to bury myself in work. Time flew by, and before I knew it, winter had come. One day, returning home, I saw a banner advertising the launch of a new smartphone model, the very same one Patrick had taken. I remembered everything and was gripped by fear again. I thought I should call my brother and ask him about the lab. Had he found it? What happened to the scientists? What did the government decide? And what measures did Patrick take? I dialed my brother's number several times, but each time I couldn't press the call button. Even after several months, pride and resentment wouldn't let me, and I was still angry at them. In the end, I decided not to call Patrick. I chose to trust him. Even if he was skeptical of my words, I hoped he had listened to me. I believed that my brother would figure out the situation, and that maybe the lab was already shut down. I was very wrong. Everything happened faster than I could have imagined. At first, there were news reports. A clean-shaven anchor in a fancy suit talked about the dangers of a new virus. What's the big deal? I thought. Viruses appear almost every year or even every day, and people tend to get sick in winter. Then the news became more alarming, reporting hundreds, thousands, then millions of cases. Suddenly, the government declared a global crisis. Lockdowns were imposed worldwide. A representative from the World Health Organization gave speeches almost every day. After a while, Mary called me. She was scared. She said patients infected with the virus were going crazy. Some attacked doctors, some died, and now she was afraid to go to work. I tried to reassure her, but I knew the situation was irreversible. Then the government declared martial law. Riots, looting, and chaos broke out across the country. There were numerous videos online of infected people attacking others. The situation in the world was rapidly deteriorating. I didn't know what to do and effectively barricaded myself at home. This was the only genius idea that came to mind. One day, Patrick called me. He said he would come soon and help me. Honestly, when it all started, I was even angrier at my brother. I had shown and told him everything. He did nothing. He allowed this virus to emerge, or so I thought. But as time passed and the world continued to go mad, I thought more often about my brother and Mary. I was relieved when Patrick called me. He arrived late at night in a military vehicle. Patrick was dressed in a military officer's uniform, and I hadn't known he had such a high rank. My brother kept surprising me. Patrick explained that it wasn't safe in the city and we needed to leave immediately. He took me to a farm on an island. It took us almost 3 days to get there, first by car, then by a small military boat. On the way, he told me what had happened. According to him, the top government officials reacted extremely negatively and dismissively to the information from the smartphone. They effectively banned any actions against the scientists and the laboratory. Patrick found out that lobbyists for this large private company were working within the government, and because of them, all information about the laboratory was being blocked, including its location. Eventually, he found the building where these experiments were conducted. But it was already too late. Monsters and mutants had escaped. The army managed to destroy many of the horrific creatures, but their burned and decaying bodies began to release a dangerous virus that infected the soldiers. By the time they realized it, it was too late. The catastrophe could not be stopped. Of course, Patrick apologized for not believing me and deeply regretted what had happened between him and Mary. However, at that moment, his primary goal was to save us. So on the farm, I found my ex-wife. Mary was very happy to see me. She took me to a house and explained that there were other people on the farm, relatives of high-ranking military officers and officials, politicians' children, celebrities, and even some billionaires. She said this was a secure place where we could wait out the storm. Patrick left immediately, as he had other matters to attend to. I stayed with Mary. The first days on the island were calm. We regularly received news about what was happening on the mainland. We had food, and the military ensured we maintained order on the farm. I began seeing Mary again. This whole situation made me reconsider our relationship, and I eventually forgave her. There was no news from Patrick, but as always, I believed he was alive and on a very important mission. Everything happened suddenly. I don't know how, perhaps through the food they brought us or through infected soldiers. But the plague reached the island. First, one person got sick, then the second, the third, and so on. The virus spread at a mad pace. We stocked up on water and food and barricaded ourselves in the house. With us was another soldier named Henry, a young, cheerful, and resilient guy. Mary, Henry, and I stayed in the house for a long time, taking turns on night watch. Sometimes we ventured outside for supplies. We were scared, but we hoped that someone from the mainland would come and rescue us. Henry was the first to get infected. He suffered from excruciating pain and eventually took his weapon and shot himself. I dragged his body outside, far from the house. Then it was Mary's turn. She tried to kill herself with a kitchen knife. I tried to stop her. I didn't want to lose my beloved. But in the end, she turned into a horrible mutant and nearly ate me. Patrick saved me again. He burst into the house and simply shot what was left of Mary. I was heartbroken. I had lost my wife once more. Patrick took me off the island. There was no one left alive on the farm except for me. Everyone had either died at the hands of monsters or turned into those terrifying creatures. Patrick had changed a lot. He was gaunt, and it was clear he wasn't taking care of himself. Now I recognized him. As crazy as it sounds, the man who had been banging on my door late at night months ago, the man who had left me that strange smartphone, was my brother Patrick. Somehow, the current Patrick had traveled back in time to warn me of the danger. I was shocked when I realized this, and immediately told him my theory. Patrick remained silent and just smiled at me. A little later, he said it was entirely possible. On the way, my brother explained that the virus was difficult to trace. According to the scientists, the virus was somewhat intelligent and could adapt to its environment, even choosing its target. Moreover, it manifested differently in each infected person. Some went mad, some turned into monsters, and others suffered intense pain. There was no way to predict how the virus would behave. Forecasts, analyses, all previously taken measures were useless, and the scientists couldn't find a cure. But they did have a plan, and that's what Patrick wanted to show me. We arrived at a secure underground laboratory. Patrick led me through all the security checkpoints, and we descended into the main hall. There were many different people: military personnel, politicians, officials, and scientists. Among them, I saw a familiar face. It was Eckelman, the scientist from the lab, the very one who started this whole process, whose research led to the catastrophe. That bastard survived and was working on something important with the others. A wave of intense anger washed over me. I knew he was to blame for everything. Without realizing it, I moved toward him. Then I grabbed him and started hitting him. People tried to pull me away, but I clung to Eckelman like a madman, shouting something. They would have shot me, thinking I was infected, if Patrick hadn't arrived. He managed to calm me down and pull me away. He led me to a small room and asked me to stay there while he dealt with the problems I had caused him. I noticed that I was holding something hard. When I looked, I saw the smartphone, the very same with 2 screens, ultra-thin, the new model. I must have grabbed it during the fight. Could it be Eckelman's phone? I knew what to do with it. The next day, Patrick came to check on me. He said he was part of an important mission. "Harry, they're sending me back in time, but not for long," he began. "It's hard to explain. We can't stay in another time permanently, or so these people in white coats say. So we'll be pulled back to our timeline. I won't be alone. There are several of us, and our task is to prevent the spread of the virus," Patrick said. He paused for a few minutes and then spoke again, more quietly and sadly. "If I had listened to you back then and done everything possible, I regret everything. Forgive me, Harry. But now I have a chance to make things right. I hope to see you again, brother." When he was about to leave, I stopped Patrick and handed him the smartphone. My brother looked at me in surprise. Then he smiled and left the room.